The rusted metal groaned in the wind, a sound the people of Millbrook had learned to ignore. It came from the old maintenance shed on the edge of town, where the railway tracks used to run before the line was abandoned in the 80s. Inside that shed lived a man the town had decided was better left alone, better left forgotten. They whispered about him in the grocery store aisles, warned their children to stay away from the eastern boundary where his property began. They called him dangerous, unstable, a relic of wars they didn't want to remember. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But on the night the worst ice storm in 50 years descended upon their small Pennsylvania town, when every light went dark and every phone went silent, that rusted shed would become the only place left with answers. And the man they feared would become the only one who could save them. But first, something unexpected had to happen. Something that would arrive on 4 legs, bleeding and desperate, in the heart of that merciless storm. The shed sat at the end of a gravel road that time and the town had both forgotten. It was a squat, angular structure built in the 1950s to house equipment for the railway maintenance crews. The corrugated metal walls were streaked with rust, like tears of orange and brown running down tired cheeks. The windows, small and high, were covered from the inside with what looked like sheets of plywood. A chain-link fence, sagging and patched in places, surrounded the property. A faded sign hung crookedly on the gate, its message barely legible through years of weather and neglect. No trespassing. Private property. Most people in Millbrook didn't need the sign to stay away. They had their own reasons, their own stories, their own fears. Inside the shed, the world was a different place entirely. The interior had been transformed over the course of 15 years into something that defied the exterior's decay. The walls were lined with salvaged wood paneling, insulated and sealed against the Pennsylvania winters. A wood stove in the corner radiated steady heat, its chimney pipe ascending through a carefully welded hole in the roof. Shelves lined every available surface, organized with military precision. Canned goods were arranged by type and date. Tools hung on pegboards, each one outlined in white paint so its absence would be immediately noticed. Books, hundreds of them, filled an entire wall, subjects ranging from electrical engineering to survival medicine to the collected works of Steinbeck and Hemingway. At the center of this ordered universe sat Thomas Garrett, a man whose 58 years had etched themselves deeply into his face but had not managed to break the straight line of his spine or the alertness in his gray eyes. He was lean, almost gaunt, with close-cropped silver hair that had once been black. His hands, scarred and calloused, moved with practiced efficiency as he worked at a long wooden table that served as his workbench. He wore faded denim jeans, a gray thermal shirt, and a canvas work vest with multiple pockets. His feet were clad in worn but meticulously maintained leather boots. Thomas was soldering a circuit board, his movements precise and unhurried. The smell of rosin flux filled the air, sharp and almost pleasant. He worked by the light of a battery-powered LED lamp, bright and focused on his task. The radio on the shelf beside him was tuned to a weather station, its volume low but audible. A man's voice, professional and measured, was discussing the approaching weather system. The forecaster's tone had shifted over the past hour from routine to concern to something approaching alarm. An ice storm of significant magnitude is now bearing down on central Pennsylvania. The National Weather Service has upgraded this to a severe weather warning. Residents should prepare for extended power outages, hazardous road conditions, and possible structural damage from ice accumulation. This is a dangerous and potentially life-threatening weather event. Residents are urged to stay indoors and avoid all unnecessary travel. Thomas set down his soldering iron and reached over to turn up the volume slightly. He listened, his expression unchanged, then turned the radio back down. He had heard this song before, in different keys and different languages. Warnings. Preparations. The calm professional voice trying to impose order on chaos. He stood up, stretched his back, and walked to the small window he had left uncovered on the eastern wall. He pulled aside a heavy curtain and looked out. The sky was the color of old pewter, heavy and low. The afternoon light, already weak, was fading fast, though it was barely past 3 in the afternoon. The trees in the distance, bare of leaves, stood like skeletal hands reaching upward. The temperature had been dropping all day. Thomas had been monitoring it on the thermometer mounted outside the window. It had gone from 38 degrees at dawn to 29 now, and it was still falling. The rain that had been falling lightly all morning had changed character. It was now freezing on contact, coating every surface with a thin, treacherous glaze. He let the curtain fall back into place and returned to his workbench. He opened a small notebook, its pages filled with neat handwriting and careful diagrams. He made a notation about the temperature and the time, then closed the book. He was not worried. Worry was an indulgence, an emotion that clouded judgment. He was prepared. Preparation was the antidote to fear. His preparations had begun years ago, long before he had ever set foot in Millbrook. They had begun in the dusty, sun-scorched landscape of another country, in the careful routines that had kept him alive when so many others had not returned. Thomas Garrett had served 22 years in the United States Army. He had been a communications sergeant, specializing in long-range radio operations and signal intelligence. He had deployed 6 times to places whose names appeared in newspapers for a few weeks and then were forgotten. He had set up communication arrays in mountain valleys, operated encrypted radio networks from forward operating bases, and listened to enemy transmissions through crackling static in languages he had learned out of necessity. He had been good at his job. Very good. He had received commendations, promotions, the respect of his peers and superiors. But the job had also marked him in ways that were not visible on any official record. The noise of war, the constant crackle and hiss of radio traffic, the sudden bursts of urgent voices reporting contact, casualties, coordinates for artillery or air support, all of it had embedded itself in his nervous system. For years, it had been background noise. He had functioned, performed, excelled. But after he retired, after the structure of military life had been removed, the noise had grown louder. It had invaded his sleep, his waking hours, his attempts at civilian normalcy. He had tried, in those first years, to reintegrate. He had taken a job as a telecommunications technician in Pittsburgh. He had rented an apartment, bought furniture, attempted to build a routine. But the city was too loud, too chaotic, too filled with voices and sirens and the unpredictable eruptions of urban life. He would find himself frozen in grocery store aisles, overwhelmed by the fluorescent lights and the press of people. He would wake at 3 in the morning, drenched in sweat, convinced he could hear mortar rounds incoming. The job had lasted 8 months before he quietly resigned. The apartment lease was not renewed. He had spent a year drifting, working odd jobs, moving from town to town, searching for something he could not name. And then, driving through central Pennsylvania on a gray November afternoon much like this one, he had seen the for sale sign on the gate of the old railway shed. The price was absurdly low. The real estate agent, a tired woman in her 60s, had been apologetic about the condition. "It's been sitting empty for 15 years, she had said. The railroad sold off the land when they shut down the line. It needs a lot of work. Most people don't want to bother with something this far gone." Thomas had walked the property, examined the structure, and made an offer on the spot. Cash, no inspection, no contingencies. The agent had looked at him as if he were mad, but she had not argued. The deal had closed in 2 weeks. He had moved in with a duffel bag of clothes, a box of tools, and a sense of purpose he had not felt in years. That had been 15 years ago. In that time, he had transformed the shed from a derelict shell into a fortress of self-sufficiency. He had insulated the walls and ceiling, installed the wood stove, run a water line from a hand-dug well. He had wired the interior for electricity powered by a combination of solar panels and a small diesel generator. He had built the shelves, organized the supplies, created order from chaos. And most importantly, he had built silence. Out here, at the end of the forgotten gravel road, there were no sirens, no crowds, no unexpected eruptions of noise. There was only the wind, the rain, the predictable rhythms of weather and season. He could control his environment, maintain his routines, keep the noise at bay. He shopped for supplies once a month, driving 30 miles to a larger town where no one knew him. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He spoke to people only when necessary, brief transactional exchanges that required nothing of him beyond basic courtesy. He paid his property taxes on time, maintained his vehicle, broke no laws, and asked nothing of anyone. The people of Millbrook, for their part, had decided he was a problem to be avoided rather than solved. He had arrived in their town without explanation, purchased the eyesore at the edge of their community, and made it clear through his demeanor that he had no interest in joining their social fabric. In a small town where everyone knew everyone, where family trees stretched back generations and newcomers were expected to integrate, Thomas Garrett's deliberate isolation was seen as hostile, suspicious, possibly dangerous. The rumors had started within months of his arrival. He's some kind of survivalist, people said. Probably has a bunker full of guns. He's mentally unstable, others whispered. You can tell by the way he won't make eye contact. Shell shock or whatever they call it now. He's been in prison, someone claimed, though no one could say for what crime or produce any evidence. The stories fed on themselves, growing more elaborate with each retelling. The fence around his property, a practical necessity to establish boundaries, became evidence of paranoia. The fact that he kept to himself became proof of antisocial tendencies. The shed itself, with its rusted exterior and covered windows, became in the town's imagination a lair, a place where something dark and dangerous festered. There had been one incident that had cemented the town's opinion. 3 years ago, during a particularly hot summer, a group of teenagers had decided to explore the old railway line. They had climbed through a gap in Thomas's fence, not out of malice but out of the boredom and bravado that afflicts 16-year-olds in small towns. They had been poking around the exterior of the shed, peering through gaps in the boards over the windows, when Thomas had emerged. He had not shouted. He had not threatened. He had simply stood in the doorway, his posture erect, his face expressionless, and said in a flat, carrying voice that brooked no argument, "This is private property. You need to leave. Now." The teenagers, startled by his sudden appearance and unnerved by something in his demeanor they could not articulate, had scrambled back through the fence and run. By the time the story made it through the Millbrook gossip network, it had been transformed. He came out with a gun, some versions claimed. He chased them off the property, others insisted. He threatened to shoot them, the most embellished accounts declared. None of it was true, but truth was less important than narrative, and the narrative that had taken hold was that Thomas Garrett was dangerous. Parents warned their children to stay away from the eastern boundary. People driving past would speed up slightly, as if proximity to the shed carried some kind of contagion. The town council had even discussed, in a closed session, whether there were grounds to force him to improve the exterior appearance of his property or perhaps condemn the structure as a public nuisance. But the property was technically outside the town limits, under county jurisdiction, and Thomas paid his taxes and broke no ordinances. There was nothing they could legally do, and so they did what small towns often do with problems they cannot solve. They ignored him, shunned him, and told themselves they were safer for it. Thomas was aware of the town's opinion. It was impossible not to be. He saw it in the wide berth people gave him in parking lots, in the way conversations stopped when he entered a store, in the suspicious glances that followed him down aisles. He felt it like a physical pressure, the weight of their fear and judgment. But he did not try to change it. He had learned, through years of painful trial, that explanations were exhausting and rarely believed. The truth, that he simply needed space and silence to manage the scars the war had left on his nervous system, was too complicated, too vulnerable to share with people who had already decided who he was. And so he had accepted his role as the town pariah. He had built his fortress, maintained his routines, and told himself that their fear was the price of his peace. If they wanted to believe he was dangerous, so be it. He would not perform normalcy to ease their discomfort. He would not pretend to be something he was not for the sake of their approval. He had survived worse than small-town gossip. The radio crackled, pulling Thomas back to the present. The forecaster's voice had taken on a new urgency. Ice accumulation is now expected to exceed 1 inch on all exposed surfaces. Power companies are reporting widespread outages beginning in western counties. Residents are advised that restoration of power may take several days. Again, this is a dangerous, life-threatening weather event. Do not attempt to travel. Stay indoors and away from windows. Thomas walked to his supply shelves and began a mental inventory. Water, he had 50 gallons stored in food-grade containers, plus the well if needed. Food, he had 3 months' worth of canned goods, dried beans, rice, oatmeal. Heat, the wood stove had a full cord of seasoned oak stacked against the back wall of the shed, enough for 2 weeks of continuous burning. Light, he had LED lanterns, candles, and batteries. Power, his solar array was equipped with a battery bank that could run his essential systems for a week without sun. The diesel generator, if needed, had 30 gallons of fuel in a jerry can. Communication, he had 3 different radio systems, each with its own purpose and capability. He was ready. The town below, he suspected, was not. Millbrook, like most small towns, ran on a thin margin of just-in-time logistics and the unspoken assumption that infrastructure would always function. The grocery store restocked twice a week. The gas station received deliveries every few days. The power grid was maintained by a regional utility company whose nearest repair depot was 40 miles away. When things worked, which they usually did, this system was efficient and invisible. When things broke, the cracks became chasms very quickly. Thomas had no illusions about the fragility of modern life. He had seen it collapse in other places, under other circumstances. He had watched entire cities lose power, water, and communication in the span of hours. He had seen what happened when the thin veneer of civilization was stripped away by disaster. It was not chaos, not immediately. First came disbelief, then denial, then a slowly dawning understanding that help was not coming, at least not soon. And then, finally, came the desperation. He did not want to be part of that cycle. That was why he prepared. That was why he lived the way he did. Not because he was paranoid or antisocial or dangerous, but because he had learned the hard way that self-reliance was not optional. It was survival. Darkness came early, hastened by the heavy clouds and the latitude of late November. By 4:30, Thomas was lighting the oil lamps that supplemented his LED lights. He preferred the warm, steady glow of flame to the harsh efficiency of electric light. There was something deeply human about fire, something that connected him to every generation of his species that had huddled around flames against the dark. He prepared a simple dinner, heating a can of beef stew on the wood stove, cutting thick slices of bread from a loaf he had baked 2 days prior. He ate slowly, methodically, his mind quiet. After dinner, he washed his dishes, banked the fire in the stove for the night, and sat down at his workbench. He was building a new antenna for his shortwave radio, a project he had been working on for weeks. The work required concentration, precision, and problem-solving. It occupied his hands and the surface of his mind, leaving the deeper parts quiet and still. He worked for 2 hours, the shed filled with the soft hiss of the wood stove and the occasional crackle from the weather radio. At 7 o'clock, he heard the first tree branch fall. It was a sound like a rifle shot, sharp and sudden, followed by a cascading crash as the branch, heavy with ice, tore through other branches on its way to the ground. Thomas paused in his work, listening. Over the next hour, the sounds increased in frequency. The ice storm was no longer approaching. It had arrived. He could hear the wind picking up, not the roar of a summer thunderstorm but a steady, relentless pressure that made the metal walls of the shed creak. He could hear the ticking sound of freezing rain hitting the roof, each drop adding its infinitesimal weight to the accumulating burden. He set aside his work and walked to the window. He pulled back the curtain and looked out into a world that had been transformed into something alien and beautiful and deadly. Every surface gleamed with ice. The fence posts were encased in crystal sheets. The trees were sculptures of glass, their branches bowed under the weight. The power lines that ran along the road, visible in the distance, sagged dangerously low, glittering like strands of diamonds in the reflected light from the shed's windows. As he watched, one of the lines snapped. There was a bright blue flash, a cascade of sparks, and then darkness. The few distant lights he could see from neighboring properties, small farms and houses scattered across the rural landscape, began to wink out one by one. Millbrook, 2 miles to the west, would be going dark right about now. Thomas let the curtain fall and turned back to his warm, lit interior. He felt no satisfaction at being proven right in his preparations, only a quiet, weary sadness. People were going to suffer tonight. Children would be frightened. Elderly residents on fixed incomes would be trying to figure out how to stay warm without heat. Families would be huddled together, burning through their candles and batteries, waiting for a dawn that would bring no relief. He pushed the thought away. It was not his problem. He had made his choices. They had made theirs. He climbed the ladder to the sleeping loft he had built in the back corner of the shed. His bed was a simple platform with a good mattress, heavy blankets, and a down sleeping bag for the coldest nights. He undressed, slid into the sleeping bag, and extinguished the lamp beside him. The darkness was complete, total, the kind of darkness that city dwellers never experience. He lay still, listening to the storm, and eventually, he slept. He woke at 2 in the morning to a sound that did not belong. It was not the creak of metal or the crack of branches. It was something else, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He lay perfectly still, controlling his breathing, listening with every sense. There it was again. A scraping sound, rhythmic and deliberate. Something was moving outside the shed. Something was at his door. Thomas slid out of the sleeping bag without a sound. He descended the ladder, his bare feet silent on the wooden rungs. He moved to the workbench and opened a drawer, withdrawing a heavy flashlight, the kind police officers carry, solid metal with a high-intensity beam. He did not own a gun. He had left that part of his life behind when he left the service. But he knew how to move, how to assess, how to respond to threats. He approached the door, his senses hyper-alert. The scratching came again, weaker now, almost desperate. And then, barely audible over the wind, he heard it. A whimper. A soft, pained sound that was unmistakably canine. Thomas hesitated for only a moment, then reached for the heavy bolt that secured the door. He slid it open and pulled the door inward, raising the flashlight. The beam illuminated a scene that stopped him cold. On the small covered porch he had built in front of the door, collapsed against the threshold, was a dog. It was a large animal, some kind of shepherd mix, its coat matted with ice and mud. But it was the blood that drew his eye. The dog's left front leg was torn open, a long ragged wound that had soaked the fur dark and left a smeared trail across the porch. The animal's eyes, amber and filled with pain and exhaustion, looked up at him. It tried to lift its head, managed only a few inches, and then let it fall back to the frozen planks. Thomas made his decision in an instant. He set down the flashlight, angled so its beam illuminated the porch, and dropped to his knees beside the dog. "Easy," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm going to help you. Easy now." He ran his hands over the dog's body, checking for other injuries, assessing. The wound on the leg was bad, but it did not appear to have severed any major arteries or the blood loss would have been catastrophic. The dog was hypothermic, its body temperature dangerously low, and it was in shock. But it was alive, and where there was life, there was a chance. He slid his arms under the dog, one behind the shoulders, one under the haunches. The animal was heavy, easily 70 pounds, and dead weight. Thomas lifted, his back and legs taking the strain, and carried the dog inside. He kicked the door closed behind him, shutting out the wind and ice. He laid the dog on a thick blanket near the wood stove, the warmest spot in the shed. The animal did not resist, had no strength to resist. Its breathing was rapid and shallow, its eyes glassy. Thomas moved with the efficiency of someone executing a drill. He grabbed towels and began carefully drying the dog's coat, rubbing gently to stimulate circulation without aggravating the wound. He stoked the fire in the stove, adding more wood, increasing the heat. He filled a bowl with lukewarm water, not hot. Hot water could shock a hypothermic system, and set it beside the dog. He gathered his medical supplies, a comprehensive first aid kit he maintained with the same care he gave everything else. He knelt beside the dog and examined the wound more closely in the bright light of an LED lantern. It was a tear, not a bite. The edges were ragged, consistent with a sharp object, possibly barbed wire or a piece of torn metal. The dog had caught its leg on something and torn the skin and muscle badly while trying to pull free. The wound would need cleaning, suturing, and bandaging. It was work he could do. He had treated worse injuries in worse conditions. He spoke to the dog as he worked, his voice a low, constant murmur. "You're going to be all right. I know it hurts. I'm going to clean this, and it's going to hurt worse for a minute, but then it will be better. You're safe now. You're warm. Just stay still." The dog's eyes tracked him, and whether it understood the words or simply the tone, it did not try to move. Thomas flushed the wound with saline solution, removing dirt and debris. The dog whimpered, a sound that cut through him, but it did not snap or struggle. He applied antiseptic, then began the slow, careful process of suturing. His hands were steady, his movements precise. He had been trained in field medicine as part of his communications role, the assumption being that radio operators were often in isolated positions where medical help was not readily available. He had sutured wounds before, on other soldiers, under less ideal conditions than this warm, well-lit shed. When the wound was closed, 23 careful stitches, he bandaged it with gauze and wrapped the leg in a flexible cohesive bandage to hold everything in place. He checked the dog's gums, which were pale but pinking up slightly in the warmth. He listened to its heart with a stethoscope from his medical kit. The rhythm was steadier now, stronger. The dog was stabilizing. Thomas sat back on his heels, suddenly aware of how much time had passed. It was after 3 in the morning. The storm outside continued its assault, the wind a constant presence, the periodic crack of branches a reminder of the ice's weight. He looked at the dog, now resting more comfortably on the blanket, its breathing deeper and more regular. The animal's eyes were closed, but its chest rose and fell with reassuring consistency. He had not intended to take on a responsibility. He had built his life around avoiding exactly this kind of complication. Animals required care, attention, and emotional investment. They were vulnerabilities, anchors to a world he had worked hard to distance himself from. And yet, he could no more have left this dog to die on his porch than he could have stopped breathing. Some things were not choices. They were simply what you did if you wanted to remain human. He covered the dog with another blanket, keeping it warm but not overheated. He refilled the water bowl, though the dog had not yet drunk. He added more wood to the stove, ensuring the temperature would remain stable. Then, finally, he allowed himself to return to the loft in his sleeping bag. But he did not sleep. He lay in the darkness, listening to the storm and to the soft breathing of the wounded animal below, and wondered what the morning would bring. Dawn came as a pale, reluctant light that did little to improve visibility. The world outside the shed was encased in ice, every surface coated in a layer that ranged from a half-inch to over 2 inches thick. The trees, unable to bear the burden, had shed branches throughout the night. The ground was a battlefield of torn limbs and shattered wood. The power lines along the road sagged at dangerous angles, several having snapped completely and now lay across the pavement like dead snakes. Thomas descended from the loft and immediately checked on the dog. The animal was awake, its amber eyes tracking his movement. The tail, a bushy plume that had been limp the night before, gave a single tentative wag. Thomas felt something in his chest loosen, a tension he had not known he was carrying. "Morning," he said quietly. He knelt beside the dog and carefully examined the bandaged leg. There was no sign of fresh bleeding, no swelling beyond what was expected. The dog's nose was cool and slightly moist, a good sign. Its eyes were clearer, more alert. He offered the water bowl, holding it close to the dog's muzzle. This time, the animal drank, lapping slowly at first, then more steadily. Thomas let it drink its fill, then set the bowl aside. "Hungry?" he asked. The dog's ears perked up at the word, another good sign. He opened a can of chicken breast, drained most of the liquid, and placed small pieces on a plate. He set it down and watched as the dog, moving carefully to avoid jostling the injured leg, ate every piece. "You've got an appetite. That's good. Means you're a fighter." Thomas refilled the water bowl and then sat back on his heels, studying the dog more carefully in the daylight. It was a mixed breed, predominantly German Shepherd with perhaps some Husky or Malamute in the build and coat. A male, not neutered, probably 3 or 4 years old based on the teeth and overall condition. The coat, beneath the mud and matted fur, was a beautiful blend of black, tan, and gray. There was no collar, no tags, no microchip scanner beeping in Thomas's equipment that might have indicated ownership. A stray, then. Or possibly abandoned. People did that, especially in rural areas, dumping unwanted animals and telling themselves the dog would find a farm or fend for itself. Most did not. They starved, were hit by cars, or fell victim to the elements. This dog had been lucky, if luck was the right word, for stumbling half-frozen and bleeding onto the porch of a recluse in the middle of an ice storm. Thomas stood and walked to the window. The view outside was apocalyptic in its beauty. The world glittered, every surface reflective, the weak sunlight fracturing into 1,000 tiny rainbows. It was also utterly impassable. The gravel road leading to his property was invisible beneath a sheet of ice. The trees lining it had formed an interlocking canopy of frozen branches that would make travel impossible even if the road surface were clear. Millbrook, he knew, would be in crisis. 2 miles might as well be 200 in these conditions. He turned on his weather radio, keeping the volume low to avoid startling the dog. The voice that emerged was the same professional tone from the night before, but the message had evolved. "The ice storm has caused catastrophic damage across the region. All roads are impassable. Power outages are affecting an estimated 200,000 customers. Crews cannot begin restoration efforts until conditions improve. The storm system is expected to remain in place for at least another 24 hours. All residents are urged to remain indoors. This is still a life-threatening situation." Thomas switched off the radio. 24 more hours. Meaning 48 total, possibly more before roads could be cleared and power restored. In a modern suburb with underground utilities and nearby resources, that was manageable. In a rural town like Millbrook, it was a disaster. He thought about the elderly woman who lived 3 houses down from the grocery store, the one he had seen struggling with her groceries. He thought about families with young children, about the volunteer fire department that was probably trying to respond to calls with equipment that could not move on the iced roads. He pushed the thoughts away. Not his problem. Not his responsibility. He had made his choices. He returned to the dog, who was watching him with an expression that seemed almost expectant. "Guess you're stuck here for a while," Thomas said. "Hope you don't mind the accommodations." The dog's tail thumped once against the blanket. Thomas found himself smiling, a small, involuntary expression that felt strange on his face. He could not remember the last time he had smiled. The day passed slowly. Thomas maintained his routines, adjusting them to accommodate his unexpected guest. He kept the fire stoked, keeping the interior temperature steady. He prepared meals for himself in small portions for the dog, who ate with increasing enthusiasm. He changed the bandage on the dog's leg in the afternoon, pleased to see that the wound was clean, the stitches holding, no signs of infection. The dog tolerated the procedure with remarkable patience, only flinching slightly when Thomas cleaned around the stitches. In the early evening, the dog attempted to stand. Thomas watched, ready to intervene if needed, as the animal carefully shifted its weight, testing the injured leg. It could not bear full weight yet, but it managed a 3-legged hobble to the door, where it looked meaningfully at Thomas. "Need to go out?" Thomas asked. He opened the door, and the dog limped out onto the porch, did its business quickly in the frozen wasteland beyond, and hobbled back inside, clearly relieved to return to the warmth. Smart dog, Thomas observed. You know to come back to the warm spot. He dried the dog's paws, wiping away the ice that had accumulated on the pads, and the animal settled back onto its blanket with a deep, contented sigh. That night, as Thomas climbed to his loft, he found the dog watching him, a question in those amber eyes. You're fine down there, Thomas said. Warmer by the stove. But an hour later, unable to sleep, he climbed back down. The dog was still awake, still watching the loft. Thomas sighed, recognizing defeat. All right. Come on, then. He patted his leg, and the dog, moving carefully, hobbled to the base of the ladder. Thomas lifted the animal, feeling the solid weight, the trust in the way the dog relaxed in his arms. He carried it up to the loft and set it on the blankets at the foot of his sleeping platform. The dog turned in a circle, found a comfortable position, and settled with a sigh that sounded remarkably human. Thomas lay back down, and for the first time in years, he was not alone in the darkness. The dog's presence was a warm, solid weight, a living thing that breathed and shifted and existed in his space. It should have made him anxious, should have triggered the need for isolation that had governed his life for so long. Instead, he found it oddly comforting. He fell asleep to the sound of the dog's breathing and slept more deeply than he had in months. He woke before dawn to find the dog's head resting on his sleeping bag, those amber eyes watching him in the darkness. Morning, Thomas said softly. The tail thumped. A routine was forming, he realized. And routines, he had learned long ago, were the architecture of sanity. He climbed down from the loft, the dog following more easily this time, adapting to its three-legged mobility. Thomas let it out, fed it, checked its wound. The healing was progressing well. Another week, perhaps 2, and the stitches could come out. Another few weeks after that, and the dog would be back to full strength. And then what? The question hung in the air, unspoken but present. Thomas did not have an answer. The morning passed. The ice storm, true to the forecast, did not relent. If anything, it intensified. The temperature remained stubbornly below freezing, and the freezing rain continued to fall, adding layer upon layer to the already dangerous accumulation. Thomas could hear trees giving way under the strain, the sharp cracks followed by the cascading crashes. His own property was sheltered by the bulk of the shed and the careful way he had maintained the few trees close to his structure, but the surrounding forest was being devastated. At noon, he turned on the weather radio for an update. What he heard made him set down his coffee cup. Authorities in Millbrook have issued an urgent appeal for assistance. The town has been without power for over 36 hours. Communication systems are down. The volunteer fire department is reporting multiple emergencies they cannot respond to due to road conditions. There are elderly residents who require medical attention, homes without heat, and a growing crisis. Anyone with emergency communication capabilities is asked to attempt contact with county emergency services. This is now a declared disaster area. Thomas stared at the radio. The professional voice continued, listing other affected towns, other crisis points, but he was no longer listening. His mind was elsewhere, in another time, another place. Thomas stood frozen before the radio, his hand still gripping the coffee cup, the liquid inside gone cold. The voice from the weather station continued its litany of disasters, but his mind had traveled backward, pulled by the irresistible gravity of memory. He was no longer in his shed. He was in a canvas tent that smelled of diesel fuel and unwashed bodies, the air thick with heat that made breathing feel like drowning. He was wearing a headset that pressed against his ears, and through the static came a voice he had not forgotten in 30 years. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Marcus Chen, a forward observer attached to a reconnaissance unit operating near the Syrian border. Thomas had been his radio lifeline, the invisible thread connecting Chen's isolated position to the artillery batteries that could provide support. They had talked every day for 3 months, professional exchanges of coordinates and situation reports that had gradually evolved into something more human. Chen had told him about his wife, about the daughter he had never met who had been born 2 weeks after his deployment. Thomas had told him about the mountains of Pennsylvania, about his plans to hike the Appalachian Trail when he got home. The day it happened, Chen's voice had come through the headset with an edge of urgency that made Thomas sit up straighter. They were observing what looked like an enemy staging area, gathering intelligence, but they had been spotted. They needed immediate extraction. Thomas had relayed the coordinates, had watched on his screen as the helicopters were dispatched. 15 minutes out, he had told Chen. "Sit tight. We're coming for you." But the helicopters never made it. A mechanical failure on the lead bird forced the entire flight to abort and return to base. By the time a backup extraction could be organized, Chen's unit was under fire. Thomas had listened, helpless, as the situation deteriorated. Chen's voice had remained calm at first, professional, calling out targets, requesting fire support. But as the minutes stretched and the fire support never came, coordination failures, communication breakdowns, the fog of war, the voice had changed. It had become tight, strained, desperate. Thomas had stayed on the radio, talking Chen through it, telling him help was coming, promising extraction, saying anything he could think of to keep that voice from breaking. But in the end, there had been nothing he could do except listen. Listen as Chen's unit was overrun. Listen as the professional soldier's voice dissolved into the terrified cries of a man who knew he was about to die. Listen as the radio went silent, not with static but with an absence so complete it felt like the universe itself had stopped. Chen had not made it home to meet his daughter. None of his unit had. The after-action report had cited multiple failures in the chain of command, communication protocols that had not been followed, requests for support that had been delayed or denied. Lessons learned, the report concluded, as if those two words could resurrect the dead. Thomas had received a commendation for his performance during the incident, for staying calm under pressure, for maintaining communication until the end. He had thrown the certificate in a drawer and never looked at it again. That had been the beginning of the end of his ability to function in the military environment. The nightmares had started then, dreams where he heard Chen's voice calling for help that never came. He had finished his enlistment, had even re-enlisted once because he did not know what else to do, but the joy had gone out of the work. Every radio call became a potential tragedy. Every voice on the other end became Chen's voice. He had lasted another 8 years before the weight became too much and he had walked away. The dog's cold nose pressing against his hand brought Thomas back to the present. He looked down to find the animal sitting beside him, those amber eyes filled with a concern that seemed almost human. Thomas set down the coffee cup, his hand shaking slightly. The past was a minefield he had learned to navigate by not going there at all. But the radio broadcast had detonated something, had breached the walls he had so carefully constructed. He walked to the window and looked out at the devastated landscape. Somewhere out there, 2 miles away, the town of Millbrook was in crisis. People were cold, frightened, possibly in danger. They had no power, no communication, no way to call for help. They were isolated, cut off, exactly as Chen's unit had been. And Thomas had the means to help. He had 3 different radio systems, each capable of reaching different frequencies and distances. He had the knowledge, the training, the experience. He could be their lifeline to the outside world. But they hated him. They feared him. They had spent years making it clear that he was not welcome in their community, that his presence was a blight on their town. They had wanted him gone, had discussed ways to force him out, had told their children to avoid him as if he carried some contagion. Why should he help people who had done everything in their power to make him feel unwelcome, unwanted, and unsafe? The rational part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive through multiple deployments and the subsequent years of isolation, told him he owed them nothing. He had not asked for their acceptance. He had not sought their approval. He had simply wanted to be left alone, and they could not even grant him that basic courtesy. Let them figure out their own solution. Let them experience the consequences of their lack of preparation. He had warned no one because no one had asked, but the signs of the storm had been there for anyone paying attention. Yet even as he tried to convince himself, he knew it was a lie. He knew what he was going to do. Because in the end, it was not about them. It was about him. It was about the man he wanted to be versus the man his trauma had tried to turn him into. Chin had died because help had not come. Thomas had lived with that failure for 30 years, had let it shape his choices, had used it as justification for his isolation. But if he turned away now, if he let his hurt pride and justified resentment prevent him from acting, he would be committing the same sin. He would be the one who did not send help when help was needed. The dog seemed to sense his internal struggle. It leaned against his leg, a solid warm presence, and made a soft sound that was neither whine nor bark but something in between. Thomas reached down and ran his hand over the animal's head, feeling the soft fur, the warm living pulse beneath. This dog had stumbled onto his porch wounded and freezing, and Thomas had not hesitated. He had not asked if the dog deserved help or whether saving it would inconvenience him. He had simply acted because it was the right thing to do. The people of Millbrook were no different. They were wounded, freezing, and desperately in need of help. The fact that they had judged him, rejected him, feared him, none of that changed the fundamental equation. They needed help. He could provide it. Everything else was just ego and wounded pride, and he had spent too many years letting those things make his decisions. He walked to his communications station, a corner of the shed he had set up with 3 different radio systems. The first was a CB radio, short range, useful for local communication but limited in power and reach. The second was a ham radio setup, more powerful, capable of reaching hundreds of miles under the right atmospheric conditions. The third was a military surplus tactical radio, encrypted and designed for field operations, capable of reaching military and emergency frequencies that civilian equipment could not access. Thomas sat down at the station and powered on the ham radio. The equipment came to life with a soft hum, the tubes warming, the needles on the meters beginning to dance. He had maintained this equipment religiously, had tested it monthly, but he had not used it for an actual emergency in all the years he had lived here. He put on the headset, adjusted the microphone, and took a deep breath. His hand hovered over the transmit button. Once he did this, once he opened this channel, there would be no going back. The town would know he had capabilities they did not. They would know he had been prepared when they were not. They would have questions, expectations, possibly demands. He pressed the button. His voice, when it came, was steady and professional, the voice of the communications sergeant he had once been. This is November 7 Tango Golf calling on the emergency frequency. This is a priority message for any station monitoring. I have information regarding a disaster situation in Millbrook, Pennsylvania. Multiple emergencies, no local communication capability, requesting immediate relay to county emergency services. Over. For a long moment, there was only static, the hiss and crackle of the ionosphere. Thomas waited, patient, knowing that emergency frequencies were monitored but not constantly. Someone would hear. Someone would respond. And then, cutting through the static like a knife, came a voice. November 7 Tango Golf, this is Whiskey 4 Echo Mike, ham operator in Harrisburg. I copy your message. What is your situation? Over. Relief washed through Thomas, though he did not let it show in his voice. Whiskey 4 Echo Mike, I am a resident near Millbrook. Town has been without power for approximately 40 hours. Ice storm has made all roads impassable. Local communication is down. I am monitoring reports of medical emergencies, elderly residents without heat, and fire department unable to respond. Town requires immediate assistance. Can you relay to county emergency management? Over. There was a brief pause, then the voice came back, now with an edge of urgency. November 7 Tango Golf, I copy all. Stand by. I am contacting county emergency services now. Maintain this frequency. Do you have specific information on casualties or critical situations? Over. Thomas glanced at the dog, who had positioned itself beside his chair, watching him with those intelligent eyes. He keyed the microphone again. Negative on specific casualty information at this time. I have been monitoring weather service broadcasts that mention multiple emergencies but no details. My position is approximately 2 miles from town center. I have full communication capabilities and can serve as relay station if needed. Over. The response came quickly. November 7 Tango Golf, County Dispatch confirms they have been unable to reach Millbrook for over 30 hours. They are extremely concerned. Can you maintain communication with town authorities if we can establish contact? Over. Thomas felt the weight of what he was agreeing to settle onto his shoulders. It was the weight of responsibility, of connection, of becoming involved in something larger than his carefully controlled solitude. But it was also familiar, a weight he had carried before, a burden he knew how to bear. Affirmative, Whiskey 4 Echo Mike. I can maintain continuous monitoring and relay. I have backup power and supplies. I am operational for extended duration. Over. Excellent, November 7 Tango Golf. County is mobilizing emergency response but road conditions are severe. You may be primary communication link for several hours, possibly longer. Stand by for further instructions. You are doing critical work. Over. Thomas acknowledged and sat back in his chair. The die was cast. He was now the communication link between an isolated town and the outside world. He was the voice in the static, the lifeline that could make the difference between tragedy and survival. It was a role he had not asked for, but it was a role he knew intimately. He had been here before, in different circumstances, in different places. This time, he told himself, this time help would come. This time the voice on the other end would not go silent. Over the next hour, Thomas's shed became a hub of organized chaos. The Harrisburg operator connected him with county emergency services, who in turn patched him through to state police and the National Guard. Each conversation required patience, repetition, and the steady professional demeanor that Thomas could summon from some deep reserve he had not known still existed. He provided coordinates, described conditions, and most importantly, he established himself as reliable. His military radio protocol, his clear concise reports, his calm tone under pressure, all of it signaled to the emergency services that they had found someone who knew what he was doing. The critical breakthrough came when the county emergency manager, a woman named Patricia Delgado, asked if he could attempt direct contact with Millbrook's emergency services. "We have their radio frequencies," she said, her voice tight with stress, "but we cannot reach them. The storm is causing massive interference, and our main relay tower is down. If you have line of sight or better atmospheric conditions from your location, you might be able to establish contact where we cannot." Thomas copied down the frequencies and call signs. He switched to his CB radio, which had better penetration for local communication in adverse conditions, and began methodically trying each frequency. The first three yielded nothing but static. The fourth brought a voice, faint and broken by interference, but unmistakably human. "Millbrook Fire and Rescue, this is November 7 Tango Golf. Do you copy?" Over. The response was fragmented, pieces of words separated by bursts of static. "November, this is Millbrook, desperate situation, multiple respond roads." Thomas adjusted his squelch, increased power, and tried again. "Millbrook Fire and Rescue, this is November 7 Tango Golf. I am a relay station. I have contact with county emergency services. Say again your situation. Speak slowly." Over. This time the voice came through clearer, and Thomas recognized it. It was Deputy Marcus Webb, a young man in his late 20s who Thomas had seen around town, always in uniform, always looking slightly overwhelmed by the responsibility he carried. "November 7, thank God. This is Deputy Webb. We have a crisis. Multiple elderly residents without heat. Medical emergency at the Thornton residence. We cannot respond. Roads are completely blocked. We need help immediately." Thomas felt the old training take over, the ability to remain calm when everyone else was panicking, to impose order on chaos through sheer force of will and clear communication. "Deputy Webb, this is November 7 Tango Golf. I copy your situation. I am in direct contact with county emergency services. They are mobilizing response but conditions are severe. I need you to provide specific information. What is the nature of the medical emergency at the Thornton residence?" Over. There was a pause, and when Webb's voice came back, it carried the sound of a man at the end of his rope. It's Linda Thornton. She is 78 years old, diabetic, has not had her insulin for over 24 hours. She is becoming disoriented. Her daughter is with her, but she needs medical intervention soon or she is going to go into diabetic shock. We cannot get to her. The roads are impassable even for our emergency vehicles. Thomas was already writing down the information, his handwriting precise despite the urgency. He keyed his other radio, the one connected to the county services. County emergency, this is November 7 Tango Golf. I have established contact with Millbrook. Critical medical emergency. 78-year-old female, diabetic, without insulin for 24 hours, showing signs of declining consciousness. Immediate intervention required. Over. Patricia Delgado's voice came back immediately. November 7, we copy. That is a life-threatening situation. National Guard has helicopters on standby, but weather conditions are marginal for flight. We need exact coordinates for any possible landing zone near that residence. Thomas relayed the question to Deputy Webb, who provided an address. Thomas consulted a detailed topographical map he had of the area, something he had acquired years ago as part of his general preparation philosophy. He calculated coordinates and relayed them to county services. There is a field behind the Millbrook Elementary School, he added. Approximately 500 yards from the Thornton residence. Clear of power lines, relatively flat. Best option for helicopter landing in current conditions. Over. There was a discussion on the other end, voices conferring, then Delgado came back. November 7, National Guard is launching a medevac helicopter. Estimated time of arrival 45 minutes. We need someone on the ground to guide them in and to prep the patient for transport. Can Millbrook Emergency Services handle that? Thomas switched back to the CB radio and relayed the information to Deputy Webb. The relief in the young man's voice was palpable. Yes, we can do that. The elementary school field. We will get there. We will get Mrs. Thornton there. 45 minutes. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, had taken on a note of something Thomas could not quite identify. November 7, who is this? Who are you? Thomas hesitated. He could remain anonymous, could keep his identity separate from his actions. But something in Deputy Webb's voice, the genuine gratitude, the desperate need for human connection in the midst of crisis, made him answer honestly. This is Thomas Garrett. I live in the old railway shed on the eastern boundary. The silence that followed was profound. Thomas could almost hear the gears turning in Webb's mind, the recognition, the shock, the cognitive dissonance of the town's boogeyman being the voice of salvation. When Webb finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost awed. You are the one helping us. You are the one who got through. Thomas felt uncomfortable with the tone, with the implications. I have radio equipment and I can reach county services. That is all. You need to focus on getting Mrs. Thornton to that field. I will coordinate with the helicopter. November 7 Tango Golf standing by. Over. He switched back to the county frequency before Webb could respond further. Over the next 45 minutes, Thomas became the central node in a complex dance of coordination. He relayed information between the helicopter pilot, county emergency services, and Deputy Webb on the ground. He provided weather updates, wind conditions, visibility reports. He talked the pilot through the approach, using his topographical maps to guide them around obstacles, down power lines, and collapsed structures. His voice remained calm, professional, the steady hand on the tiller in rough seas. The dog remained beside him throughout, a silent presence that somehow made the weight of responsibility more bearable. Thomas found himself occasionally reaching down to touch the animal's head, grounding himself in that simple physical contact. The dog seemed to understand the importance of what was happening, remaining quiet and still, only its eyes moving to track Thomas's actions. Finally, the pilot's voice came through. November 7, this is Medevac 2-1. We have visual on the field. I see emergency personnel and what looks like a patient on a stretcher. We are beginning our approach. Your guidance was excellent. This would not have been possible without you. Over. Thomas acknowledged, then switched to update Deputy Webb. Millbrook, the helicopter is landing now. Be prepared for rotor wash and follow pilot instructions for patient transfer. Over. He listened as the operation unfolded, heard the change in engine pitch as the helicopter touched down, heard Webb confirm that Mrs. Thornton was being loaded aboard. Then the helicopter was lifting off, climbing back into the gray sky, carrying its precious cargo toward a hospital and the insulin that would save her life. County Emergency Services came back on the radio, Patricia Delgado's voice warm with approval. November 7 Tango Golf, that was exceptional work. You have saved a life today. We are showing multiple other emergency situations in Millbrook. Are you able to continue serving as communications relay? Thomas looked around his shed, at his supplies, his fuel reserves, his equipment. He looked at the dog, who was watching him with those amber eyes that seemed to see more than an animal should be able to see. He thought about Marcus Chen, about the voice that had gone silent because help had not come in time. He thought about who he wanted to be, about the man he had been before the war and the man he had become after. And he made his choice. Affirmative, County. I am set up for extended operations. I have power, supplies, and full communication capability. I can serve as primary relay for Millbrook until roads are clear and normal communication is restored. November 7 Tango Golf standing by for further tasking. Over. What Thomas did not know, could not have known from his isolated position, was that his transmissions were being heard by more than just emergency services. Ham radio operators, monitoring the emergency frequencies, had picked up his clear, professional traffic. They had heard the comm voice coordinating a life-saving helicopter rescue in conditions that had grounded most aircraft. They had heard the precision, the competence, the unwavering steadiness. And they had begun to spread the word through their networks. There is someone in Millbrook, the messages said. A relay station. Call sign November 7 Tango Golf. He is keeping them alive. In Millbrook itself, the effect of what had just happened was seismic. Deputy Webb had returned to the fire station, which had become the de facto command center in the absence of power and normal communication. The building was crowded with people, town officials, volunteer firefighters, concerned citizens, all huddled together in the cold, running out of options and hope. Webb had been operating a hand-crank emergency radio, trying desperately to reach anyone, when Thomas's voice had come through the static like a miracle. Now, as Webb stood before the assembled group and explained what had just happened, how a helicopter had reached Mrs. Thornton, how they had a communication link to the outside world, how help was finally coming, he had to also explain who had made it possible. The name Thomas Garrett fell into the room like a stone into still water, the ripples of shock and disbelief spreading outward. Robert Chen, the fire chief and coincidentally no relation to the Lieutenant Chen from Thomas's past, was a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s with a reputation for no-nonsense practicality. He had been one of the voices at town meetings arguing that the old railway shed was a hazard that needed to be addressed. Now he stared at Deputy Webb as if the young man had started speaking a foreign language. The man in the shed? That is who you are talking about. The crazy hermit? Webb, to his credit, did not back down. Chief, I do not know what he is, but I know what he just did. He established contact with county emergency services when we could not. He coordinated a medevac helicopter landing in near-impossible conditions. He saved Linda Thornton's life. And he is still on the radio, ready to help with other emergencies. Whatever we thought about him, we were wrong. The room fell silent. People looked at each other, seeing their own prejudices reflected back, their own certainty suddenly made uncertain. Barbara Mitchell, who ran the town's small library and had been among the most vocal in her suspicion of Thomas, spoke up, her voice small. But we do not even know him. How can he be doing this? Why would he help us after how we have treated him? Webb shook his head. I do not know, Mrs. Mitchell. I did not ask him why. I was just grateful, he answered. He paused, then added quietly, maybe that is the point. Maybe he is helping us because it is the right thing to do, not because we deserve it. The words hung in the cold air of the fire station, an indictment and a revelation. Chieftain ran a hand over his face, suddenly looking older than his years. All right, he said finally. We have other people who need help. The Kowalski family on Elm Street, their house has no insulation and they have 3 kids under 10. Old Mr. Patterson on Birch, he is on oxygen and his concentrator is electric. We need to get them to somewhere warm, somewhere with power. If this Garrett can help coordinate that, then we use him. We can figure out the rest later. Webb nodded and returned to his radio. Over the next several hours, Thomas coordinated 3 more emergency responses. Each one followed the same pattern: calm assessment of the situation, clear communication with county services, precise guidance for incoming help. A National Guard truck, equipped with chains and a plow blade, made it through to evacuate the Kowalski family and Mr. Patterson, along with 6 other vulnerable residents. Thomas provided turn-by-turn directions, warned them of downed power lines and collapsed structures, guided them through a landscape that had become unrecognizable. Each time, his voice remained steady, professional, devoid of emotion. He did not ask for thanks. He did not make speeches. He simply did the job, the same job he had done decades ago in different circumstances, being the voice that connected isolated people to the help they needed. The difference was that this time, help was arriving. This time, the voices on the other end were not going silent. This time, he was succeeding where he had once failed. As evening approached and the light began to fail, Thomas sat back in his chair, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. He had been at the radio for nearly 8 hours straight, his only breaks to let the dog out and to refill his coffee mug. His voice was hoarse, his eyes burned from staring at the equipment meters, and his shoulders ached from tension. But there was something else, something he had not felt in a very long time. Purpose. Satisfaction. The sense that his life had meaning beyond mere survival. The dog, sensing his exhaustion, pushed its head under his hand, demanding attention. Thomas smiled and scratched behind the animal's ears. "You are a good listener," he said quietly. "Never once complained about how long this is taking." The dog's tail wagged, and Thomas felt something in his chest loosen, a tightness he had carried for so long he had forgotten it was there. The radio crackled, and Patricia Delgado's voice came through. "November 7 Tango Golf, this is County. We are standing down for the night. Weather Service is calling for the storm to break by morning. Plows will be able to start clearing roads at first light. You have done extraordinary work today. On behalf of everyone here, thank you. You have made a real difference." Thomas keyed the microphone one last time, his voice showing the strain now. "County, November 7 Tango Golf. Happy to assist. I will maintain monitoring through the night in case of further emergencies. Standing by on this frequency. Over and out." He powered down the equipment except for one receiver set to monitor the emergency frequency, and sat in the sudden quiet. Outside, the storm had finally begun to ease. The freezing rain had stopped, though the temperature remained below freezing, preserving the ice that coated everything. Through the window, he could see the first stars beginning to appear through breaks in the clouds. The crisis was not over, but the worst had passed. Thomas climbed to the loft, the dog following him with increasing ease, its injured leg growing stronger each day. He lay in his sleeping bag, the animal curled at his feet, and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow, he knew, would bring complications. The town knew who he was now. They knew what he had done. They would have questions, expectations, possibly gratitude he did not know how to accept. His isolation, the carefully constructed wall between himself and the world, had been breached not by force but by his own choice. There would be no going back to the anonymous existence he had built. But as he lay there in the darkness, listening to the dog's steady breathing and the gradually quieting wind, Thomas realized he did not want to go back. Something had changed in him over the course of this day. Some weight he had been carrying, the burden of Chen's death, the guilt of survival, the shame of his own limitations, had shifted. It had not disappeared, would never disappear, but it no longer defined him. He had been tested and he had not failed. He had been given a chance to be the help that arrives in time, and he had risen to meet it. The dog shifted, moving closer, and Thomas reached down to rest his hand on the warm fur. This animal had stumbled into his life by accident, wounded and desperate, and he had helped it without question. The town had needed help, and he had provided it despite their history, despite his own justified resentment. Maybe that was what redemption looked like, not grand gestures or dramatic transformations, but simply choosing to be decent, to be useful, to be present when presence mattered. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in 30 years, when sleep came, it was not haunted by Chen's voice calling for help that would never arrive. Instead, it was filled with the memory of other voices, grateful voices, voices that had said thank you, we could not have done this without you, you saved us. And in the morning, Thomas knew, he would wake to a world that had changed, a world where the hermit in the shed was no longer a figure of fear but something else entirely. What that something was, he would have to discover. But for now, in this moment, it was enough to sleep peacefully, a wounded dog at his feet and the knowledge that he had done good work. Dawn arrived with crystalline clarity, the sky scrubbed clean by the departing storm. Thomas woke to sunlight streaming through the small window, something he had not seen in days. The dog was already awake, sitting at attention, ears perked toward the door. Then Thomas heard it too, the distant rumble of heavy machinery, the scrape of plow blades against ice-covered asphalt. The world was coming back to life. He descended from the loft and went through his morning routine, feeding the dog, checking its wound, letting it outside. The healing continued remarkably well, the stitches clean and holding firm. Another week and they could come out. He made coffee and stood at the window, watching the transformed landscape glitter in the morning sun. Beautiful and deadly in equal measure, nature's indifference made visible. The radio crackled to life without him touching it. November 7 Tango Golf, this is County Emergency Services. Do you copy? Thomas moved to the equipment and keyed the microphone. County, this is November 7 Tango Golf. I copy. Go ahead. Patricia Delgado's voice came through, warm and professional. Good morning. Road crews have made significant progress overnight. We have established surface access to Millbrook. Emergency services are being restored. Your assistance over the past 2 days has been invaluable. We would like to meet you in person if you are willing. Before Thomas could respond, another voice broke into the channel. November 7, this is Deputy Webb in Millbrook. Sir, there are people here who would like to thank you. The whole town wants to thank you. Would you consider coming down? Thomas looked at the dog, who tilted its head as if waiting for his decision. He had known this moment would arrive, had steeled himself for it through the night. But knowing and doing were different things. His instinct screamed at him to decline, to maintain his boundaries, to retreat back into the safety of isolation. Yet something had changed in him, something fundamental that would not let him hide anymore. He keyed the microphone. Deputy Webb, I will come down. Give me an hour. He showered in cold water, the solar heating system not yet recovered from days of cloud cover. He dressed in clean clothes, his best pair of jeans, a pressed flannel shirt, his leather jacket. He looked at himself in the small mirror he kept by the workbench and saw a stranger, a man who had spent years hiding and was now choosing to be seen. The dog watched him prepare, sensing something significant was happening. Thomas knelt beside the animal and examined its bandaged leg one more time. You need to stay here, he said quietly. You are not ready for a walk that long yet. I will be back soon. The dog whined softly but settled onto its blanket when Thomas commanded it to stay. He filled the water bowl, left food within easy reach, and opened a window slightly for fresh air. Then, with a final look at the small fortress he had built, he stepped outside and locked the door behind him. The walk down the gravel road was treacherous, ice still coating every surface, but Thomas moved with careful deliberation. The 2 miles took him nearly an hour, his boots crunching on frozen ground, his breath visible in the frigid air. As he approached the town limits, he saw the damage the storm had wrought. Trees snapped like matchsticks, power lines draped across roads, houses with collapsed porches and shattered windows. It looked like a war zone, and Thomas felt the old familiar tightness in his chest. But he kept walking. At the edge of Main Street, a small crowd had gathered outside the fire station. Thomas recognized Deputy Webb, Chief Chen, Barbara Mitchell from the library, and dozens of others whose faces he knew from brief encounters over the years. As he approached, the crowd fell silent, all eyes turning toward him. Thomas felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he had not experienced since leaving the service. Every instinct told him to turn and run. Deputy Webb stepped forward, his young face serious and respectful. "Mr. Garrett, thank you for coming. Thank you for everything you have done." The crowd murmured agreement, and Thomas saw something in their faces he had never seen before. Not fear, not suspicion, but genuine gratitude mixed with shame. They knew how they had treated him. They knew what he had done despite that treatment. The equation did not balance in their favor, and they knew it. Chief Chen cleared his throat and moved to stand beside Webb. "Mr. Garrett, I owe you an apology. We all do. We judged you without knowing you. We feared you because we did not understand. You had every reason to ignore us, to let us figure out our own problems. But you did not. You saved lives. Linda Thornton is home this morning because of you. The Kowalski children are safe because of you. You are a hero, sir, and we have treated you shamefully." Thomas felt his throat tighten. He was not prepared for this, for the weight of their collective remorse, for the simple human decency of an apology he had never expected to receive. He had come expecting awkwardness, perhaps transactional gratitude. He had not expected this raw honesty, this acknowledgement of their failure. "I am not a hero," Thomas said finally, his voice rough. "I just have radio equipment and I know how to use it. That is all." But Chief Chen shook his head. "No, sir. It is more than that. You chose to help when you did not have to. That is what makes the difference." Barbara Mitchell stepped forward, tears streaming down her weathered face. "My nephew was in one of the houses you helped evacuate. He has asthma and the cold was making it impossible for him to breathe. You saved him, Mr. Garrett." She paused, struggling with emotion. "I am so sorry for the things I said about you, for the fear I spread. I was wrong. So terribly wrong." One by one, others came forward. Some offered apologies. Some simply shook his hand. Some had tears in their eyes. Thomas stood and accepted it all, feeling something inside him crack and then slowly begin to heal. These were not perfect people. They had made mistakes, had let fear override their better judgment. But they were trying to make amends, and there was courage in that. Finally, Chief Chen spoke again. "Mr. Garrett, the town council met this morning. We would like to make you an official part of our emergency response system. We want to install a proper radio setup at the fire station, and we would like you to train our people on how to use it. We will pay you, of course, and more importantly, we want you to know you have a place here. A real place, if you want it." Thomas looked around at the faces surrounding him, at the town that had rejected him now offering acceptance. Part of him wanted to refuse, to maintain his independence, to protect himself from future hurt. But he thought about the dog waiting for him in the shed, about the way it had trusted him despite its own wounds. He thought about the voices on the radio, the lives saved, the purpose he had rediscovered. Some walls needed to remain standing. Others needed to come down. "I will help train your people," Thomas said. "And I will maintain my equipment as a backup. But I do not need pay. What I need is to be left to live my life on my terms. No more petitions. No more campaigns to remove me. Just let me be." Chief Chen extended his hand. "You have my word, Mr. Garrett. The town's word. We will leave you in peace. And if you ever need anything, you just have to ask." Thomas shook his hand, feeling the firmness of the grip, the sincerity behind it. As he turned to walk back up the hill, Deputy Webb called out. "Mr. Garrett, how is the dog doing? The one that showed up during the storm?" Thomas stopped and turned back, surprised. You know about the dog? Webb smiled. Small towns, sir. Word travels. Someone saw you carrying it inside. Is it going to make it? Thomas felt a small smile tug at his lips. Yes, he is going to make it. He is a fighter. Like you folks. Webb nodded, and there was understanding in his eyes. That is good to hear, sir. That is real good to hear. The walk back up the hill felt shorter, lighter somehow. When Thomas opened the door to his shed, the dog was waiting, tail wagging furiously despite its injury. Thomas knelt and let the animal shower him with enthusiastic licks, laughing for the first time in years. You were right to trust me, he said quietly. And maybe I was right to trust them. Maybe we all just needed a storm to see each other clearly. That evening, as the power began flickering back on across the valley and the town of Millbrook slowly returned to normal life, Thomas sat at his workbench with the dog at his feet. He was not working on anything in particular, just enjoying the quiet companionship, the warmth of the stove, the sense that his small world had expanded without losing its essential safety. He had not thought about Marcus Chin once today. The ghost had finally been laid to rest. Outside, the ice began its slow melt under the returning sun. The world was healing, and so was he. Not completely, perhaps never completely, but enough. More than enough. The dog shifted, resting its head on Thomas's boot, and somewhere in the distance, a radio crackled with evening traffic, voices connecting across the invisible distances, proof that no one had to be alone unless they chose to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.